You are now live.
Send a Sorokin and you wave by, hit got it on the phone right there behind you. Hit got it. Okay, so we are now live and we got rid of the warning sign that will be broadcast. This is Senate Finance, Tuesday, April 12th, and we have a very short agenda today. We're gonna do what I had originally hoped we would do on Friday, but then Graham was felled, and talk a little bit about what the budget is looking like, what the revenues are looking like, what we might need to do with some possible strategies to get a revenue bill and a budget bill. We have the child tax credit bill, and that's really where a lot of the issues with revenue are hinging, because it is the newest large expenditure to be proposed. So I've been meeting, I met yesterday, and met Friday after committee, with appropriations and joint fiscal, just trying to get a handle on it and a handle on what we need to do. So Graham, you can start walking us through, and Senator Kitchell has said she will be glad to come over at any time, from across the hall, and, fill us in, or if we feel we need any further kind of perspective from her. So Graham, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. For the record, Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. I'm going to share a document on my screen here for the committee. And it should be posted on the committee's webpage. It's called.
There we go. That's better. One page.
So what I'll be presenting today is based upon they're trying to put forward a path to sort of close the budget on the Senate side, based upon some of the conversations that I was on with Senator Kitchell and Senator Cummings. Basically, there was a desire to come up with a path where the amount of tax actions that came out in the tax bill or bills, plural, would reduce overall revenue somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $35 million. To give that some context, the House budget was based upon a revenue tax package that reduced the total taxes by $46.54 million on net. And so rather than sort of raising revenues to offset the entirety of that tax reduction, it is accommodated for in their budget. So in most years, when there aren't very large surpluses available and revenues are sort of normal, not elevated like they are now, whenever the House would pass a revenue package that reduced taxes, typically they would offset that with increased revenue. So the overall revenue bill would usually be slightly positive or slightly negative. But because of the elevated revenues, they were able to accommodate a large tax cut, and the budget was able to be built with building in roughly $46.5 million worth of revenue reductions. The Senate Appropriations Committee is building their budget right now. And the conversation that I had was on with Senator Kitchell and Senator Cummings is that the ask was somewhere in the neighborhood of $32 to $35 million in overall tax reduction, which essentially gives the Senate Appropriations Committee about $14 to $15 million more in available revenue to help build their budget. And so the idea here is to help come up with a path forward to think about all the tax proposals that have come before this committee and help create a package that would reduce revenues on net by about $32 to $35 million. Is everyone with me so far in sort of the background context here?
Sorry. Okay. And all right, the 46.5 million, that's the additional expenditures in the
That's-
budget. The tax reduction is,
That's right. So the House passed the bill, all their revenue bills on net reduced total available revenues for the state. So total available revenues to build a budget by 46.54. So when the House built their budget, they sort of spent $46.54 million less than they, otherwise could have, if that makes sense.
okay,
So
because it was increased revenue.
yes, because there was a higher revenues in the forecast, and so the House budget accommodates that overall tax reduction. What the Appropriations Committee across the hall is more or less asking for is more space than the House to help, cover additional needs and different priorities on the spending side of the budget.
Okay. Senator Bray has a question.
Mr. Campbell, so on that 46.54, can you break it out even approximately? How much of that is reducing a tax rate how much of that is that tax expenditure versus simply reducing the tax rate or something on an existing tax? I'm trying to,
Sure.
how do we get there?
Yeah, so the 46.54 that's coming from the House, the vast majority of that starts with the child tax credit, which costs $48 million coming out of the House. The House also generated some small additional tax expenditures. So one of those was the expansion of the Social Security exemption, which is in the child tax credit bill. Another was in their S-53 that came over to you all. They expanded the military, or they didn't expand, they created a new military retirement exemption. And then there's the corporate tax bill, which on net is about a revenue neutral bill in fiscal year 23. And then the final thing is the property transfer tax surcharge in H437 that's in Senate Finance right now. And so the sort of moving pieces there, all net out to a negative $46.54 million position on tax bills.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And you've listed all of those in that first bulleted section.
So the first bulleted section basically is laying out a potential way to get to about $32.97 million. So this isn't, a agreed upon proposal or anything, but after the conversation between the appropriations chair and the chair of this committee, I went back and tried to sort of solve the puzzle, if you will, to try to get to a point where how could you, within the existing tax bills that are in this committee, how could you get to a point or a position where your tax bills on net reduced revenues by only 32 to 35 million versus 46.54 for the House.
And the reason we need to do this is because appropriations wants to be able to do some different funding, and there's also been some unanticipated costs come in since the budget left. What is it, personal care attendants negotiated a new contract. I think that's the title. And that's adding money. I know there's several things that have come in. I know in health and welfare, we have 3 pages of bullets for additional requests that have come in. Starting with $6 million from the food bank. So there's a lot of additional requests out there. Plus, we are obliged to fund the union contract. So we've got that. Senator Bray and then Senator Hardy.
So the 4654, is that how far out of, whatever, we know we'll get to balance, but is that how far out of balance we are currently? And-
No. So don't think of this as the budget is out of balance. The House's budget is balanced when it came over to you all. But what this means is that the House budget had to accommodate in reduced spending $46.54 million in tax cuts that came out of the House. So their budget came over to you all balanced. This is accounted for in their budget, but the way they account for this is by spending less money. And so what the Appropriations Committee is really asking of you all right now is we want to be able to spend more. So please don't cut taxes as much, if that makes sense. So don't cut taxes by 46.54, cut taxes by 32 to 35 million. So we have more revenues available to spend.
Okay, and if all right, thank you, that's all.
There's been the things that have come in, there's also different Senate priorities. I know one of the top priorities has been trying to get those home and community-based services. The House got from 7%. I know they'd like to get to 10, but it doesn't look like they're gonna get there, but they'd like to at least get up to 8, maybe 9. But we're trying to figure this all out. Senator Hardy, and then Senator Sirotkin, and Senator Brock.
So, Graham, do you have this in a table?
Yes, I have it in a table. I figured it'd be easier to walk through in bullet points for the community.
Oh, I like, okay. I mean, I can follow it. It's just easier to look at for me in a table, but,
Sure.
but this also makes the assumption that we're gonna do some kind of child tax credit, which
Yes,
I don't know that
yes.
we've decided that yet. We talked about it, but I don't know that we've decided it yet.
No, we have not voted on that bill mostly because we've been waiting for pros to tell us if we could afford to vote on it.
And do you have, Graham, the analysis of modeling it in a more progressive way?
Yes, that's coming after this presentation.
Yeah,
Okay,
we're gonna
great.
do the child tax credit next, because that's where a lot of this will hinge. Okay. Yeah, Senator Sirotkin and Senator Brock.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So how much in tax reductions has this committee agreed upon at this point?
You have agreed upon the third black bullet point here. So
I can't see because you got to go up a little higher because there's
Oh.
something at the bottom blocking it. Okay,
We've got the,
right here.
there it is. Okay.
So this is what you've agreed upon is these items, and these things shake out to be, approximately, on net, about $2-ish million in total tax increases because you have those corporate tax things that are ups. So that's what you have passed so far.
but we also know we're going to conference and that single sales is very important to the House. I've also been told that their military retirement is important. So that is a final, that's still subject to negotiation. And that's the reason there hasn't been a committee of conference because Representative Ansel knows that however we deal with all these other things, those numbers are gonna come into play when we do S-53. I've got
Madam
Senator
Chair,
Walker and then Senator Bray.
my question's been answered.
Okay. Senator Bray.
Graham, I know you're not here to maybe the chair knows, you're not here to report on how the House made decisions. I'm just trying to
I don't know.
understand how that child tax credit landed at 48 million. I don't know if there were iterations of it that were much less expensive than that. or more expensive and then they settled at 48? Can you say anything about the range of total costs?
The child tax credit, as it was being considered by the House, always ranged somewhere between, $45 and $55 million. The original bill was a $1,200 tax credit that was not limited at all by income. And that proposal, I estimated the cost around $52 million. And as they, worked on it, they eventually put in a income threshold of $200,000, which made the cost $48 million. So it was always in the neighborhood of, $45 to $55 million. And to be clear, there was some guidance to that, because overall the governor's tax package, as it came over in his budget, was about $50 million. And so the idea was, if the governor's tax package is around $50 million, that's sort of the universe or the space that the legislature may have if we're sort of using the governor's budget as a template. So the goal was to come in with a total tax package that ended up in reducing overall revenues by around 50 million, and the House ended up reducing it by about 46.54 million.
And the 1,200 was that inspired by the federal credit? Is that we modeled on that, except that was a monthly, correct?
Yeah, the original proposal that came out of that was introduced in the House was $100 per child per month, and so that's how you ended up at $1,200.
Thank you. The feds have a big advantage, though. They have a printing press,
Yes,
and we don't.
we don't. Thus, the contortions that we are going through. And after this, we're going to go through school meals versus toxic substances in school air. So it's not gonna get any better. And I have volunteered to give Senator Kitchell a printing press for Christmas, but so far, she is not taking me up on that. And that would make life easier. So, and I think it was the total tax package, there was a total amount in there that we had this year that was felt would be done, and the governor had proposals for tax credits to specific groups of people, I believe nurses, childcare workers. I'm probably missing some. We've been through some of the proposals. We got the listing of the ones we found. I think the House felt this would hit more people. It would be broad ranged and it could be ongoing, not based on a need we see this year. But that's as much as I've been able to pick up just from discussions.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Senator Pearson.
I keep hearing you say that the House is quite interested in its single sales factor
Yes,
proposal, which we know, that's why they passed it.
right.
I guess I would just point out, that's not the Senate's position. We passed that bill, I think 30-0.
Yeah, I made that very clear to them.
But more than that, and more relevant to this discussion, if they want to insist on that and we were to agree, it seems to me we would have them figure out the $11 million problem, not take it on ourselves. So I appreciate that the process is always a negotiation, but them saying that they want it ought to, I would think the Senate's position is quite strong, since what they want costs $11 million and what we want does not. And I guess I would just urge folks to pair them, before we would consider acquiescing. Seems like they would have an obligation to tell us how to pay for
How to
it.
get it. Bram, it's that number, the cost of the single sales factor has been evolving I don't think you're looking at 11 million at this point, are you?
So just to take one step back, I think the way Senator Pearson is classifying it, for the purposes of your budget, as you're building the budget, the Senate has a position on the corporate tax bill. And the Senate's position does not include the single sales factor. It also doesn't include the corporate minimum tax. So for the purposes of, doing the budget, here at JFO, when we're sort of looking at revenues, the Senate position is what you all have passed, which does not include that. So to the extent that if that were to get negotiated into a conference committee as 53, then the conference committee for the budget would have to accommodate for that reduced revenue. But right now, for the purposes of the Senate budget, you have stated your position on the corporate tax bill. To get to your question, for fiscal year 23, the single sales factor costs $4 million because it's only implemented for half a year. But then when it's fully implemented next year, it costs $11 million. And that is the most updated estimate.
So, but we've also raised some revenue, right?
So the Senate's position on the corporate tax bill is just these three pieces here. The repeal of the throwback rule, the 80-20 language, and the Joyce to Finnegan. And that in fiscal year 23 is about, let me see here, do some math in my head, is about, $3 million to the good. But in future years, as all those become full year effective, the Senate's position is about $8 million to the up. So it would offset some of the revenue increase, some of the revenue decrease rather from the single sales factor, but not all of it.
So, and that's also how we have not passed out the property transfer tax. The House did, and the House spent it. So that's also putting 2.8 million in the negative across the hall. And we've been working on that one. I was looking at that as a vehicle to do a couple of these things, but we may not need it. So, any other questions?
I have a question.
Senator Siraki.
On the property transfer tax, did the money get dedicated for any purpose?
No, it was strictly general fund revenue. So if I can, so this what you're seeing in front of you is just a sort of path forward. If the goal and the number is $32 to $35 million, here's one way that you could get there. So the first bullet point lays out, here's items that have not passed the Senate that would need to be approved in Senate Finance in order to make it happen. If you pass a version of the child tax credit, that cost $48 million in the House. If you were able to pass a child tax credit that was, say, $45 million instead of $48 million, it would give the Senate budget more room. And as a note here in this bullet point, there's been talk about making this a more progressive tax credit than the House. And I'll touch upon that in the second half of this presentation, is ways that you can get to $45 million on the child tax credit and make it more progressive. If you included the securities registration fees increase, so this is the mutual fund fees that have been talked about, that adds another $6 million. And then if you did the property transfer tax surcharge at $2.8 million, then if you did not pass the Social Security exemption that was in H510, that's the child tax credit bill, then you're taking that negative out of this sort of construct. And then you just count the things that you've already passed. That essentially gets you to $32.97 million. That would be hitting the target that the Appropriations Committee has kind of laid out recently, given the increased needs and the demands that they are looking to satisfy on the spending side. And so just to maybe make things a little bit more straightforward, one idea that you could possibly explore is just taking H510 and putting, all of these tax, ideas into that bill, because that way, if something happens to that bill, down the line, the budget, if it say fails, if that tax bill fails, then the budget will have increased revenues. The budget won't rely on revenues from 3 or 4 different revenue bills. It'll really only rely on the revenues from one single bill. So you I think right now have about 3 possible vehicles you could put tax proposals in. One is H510, the tax credit bill, child tax credit bill. Another is H437, that's in your committee. That's the bill with the property transfer tax surcharge in it. Also the manufactured homes credit, and also the manufacturing input sales tax.
Manufactured homes has already gone in one of the economic development bills. So it's essentially out because you don't usually pass, if you pass the same bill twice, it gets really messy.
That's correct. So, and the third bill that you could put it on, which is probably, I think, less favorable, is the miscellaneous tax bill. That bill this year is much more technical in nature. And so, but you do in theory have 3 bills. And so you could split up the revenue ideas into those 3 bills, or you could, as sort of being suggested here in this way forward, is just have it all on the child tax credit bill. And so more or less what you're seeing in the first half of this page is a way to get to $33 million in tax reduction. You would have to pass a child tax credit that is smaller than the House. You would have to pass a mutual fund fees increase, and you would have to pass the property transfer tax surcharge. And then finally, you would have to remove the Social Security exemption that's in H510. Really, those 4 pieces would be sort of the decision points to get you to $35 million or so.
Senator Brock.
Just a question. Typically, when we think about fees, we think about covering the cost of delivering the service or product associated with it. Is there any objective reason other than increasing revenue that we would raise mutual fund fees? Are there any cost increases associated with mutual fund registration?
No, and go. Graham, it's you.
I was just say my understanding is that no, not, but these particular fees, and I'll let Dan Dickerson jump in later when he talks about these additional revenue options. These particular fees are not sort of subject to the general rule about tracking and the cost of regulating these types of securities.
So
that other
from the regulatory costs.
Yeah,
Okay,
they
that's
have
good.
always contributed, is it 30, 20, 30? They contribute a lot of $1 million to the general fund. And they are generally not paid by Vermonters. They're national fees. They're a whole different structure. Senator Bray.
So I'm just stepping back from the details of getting to a workable number. And wondering aloud with the committee about a roughly $48 million tax credit. Is it your understanding that this is going to be an ongoing obligation, right? And then the other major spend, I've heard that the $29 million for meals is actually closer to 40. So I'm just, and we're hearing
Different funds.
forecasts around cloudier weather ahead. So I'm just looking at something in the neighborhood of, $80 to $90 million of ongoing expense when good investments. I'm not saying anything like they're not good investments, but I'm just wondering about what are we setting ourselves up for?
And these are looked at, I mean, we can always undo them, but to undo a tax credit for children, just like undoing feeding children would be very hard. They're fortunately in 2 different funds. One's in the Ed Fund and one's in this one. They're both, I'm gonna look to Graham to talk about if you know what, I know that if not next year, the year after, we are forecast, the last I heard, Graham, check my memory, is that the economists were saying it's going to level out and we're going back to our normal alligator, yeah, that thing, but that they weren't anticipating it to drop off suddenly. So Grandma, is that my memory serving me correctly? So this is being looked at as the new base.
That's correct. Yes. So based upon the forecast, our elevated revenues that are here right now are expected to remain elevated to the, in the future, but the growth rate of that is relatively small. So it's not, we're sort of shifting up a level and then we're having slow growth after that. And so when I think I came into this committee in late January to talk about, the alligator graph and the growth in revenue. So the idea here is the General Assembly, if in terms of making tax cuts or spending decisions, it would be I think there is room to create and spend either through the tax code, through tax cuts, or through the appropriations process and spending. There is room in terms of the revenues to absorb that, but you want to be very careful that you don't create new programs that have very high growth, because the growth in revenue is what is sort of the problem in the future. And so in terms of these tax proposals, the child tax credit, we don't foresee it growing significantly in cost, if at all. And that's because the amount of children in Vermont has steadily declined over the past 20 years. And we don't necessarily think this will completely arrest or change that trend. And so the amount of children receiving this tax credit, we're projecting it'll be relatively flat over the next 4 or 5 years. And the total cost will generally stay if you pass the House version, would stay in the $48 million range. And so I think that sort of construct fits in with the general idea that there is capacity on the revenue side to incur tax cuts. But if you're going to do it, you don't want to do one that grows a lot in cost. And so I can't speak to the spending side or what's in the House's budget that might grow significantly in cost. So I guess that would be a question for the House. But with respect to the school meals that passed, that is estimated to be, I think, somewhere in the high $20 million in fiscal year 23, growing to potentially $40 million in the out years. There's still discussion upon where that cost is going to be borne. Is it going to be borne by the general fund, or is it going to be borne by the education fund? So I think last I was following the conversation is they were currently looking for ways to fund that obligation in the House, either through a sugar sweetened beverage tax or an expansion of the sales tax base.
Child tax credit doesn't have an inflation adjuster or anything like that, so for the time being, it's flat.
I think that's right. If anything, it might be declining just because the number of children in Vermont has been on a steady decrease over the past 20 years.
Madam Chair, could I ask a question?
Yes, Senator Pearson.
Graham, on your last 2 points, is there, just for the school meals, we're not really focused on that, but we've had universal school meals for the last 2 years. Is the idea that the cost is not stable? Is that because of the federal match, or I'm surprised to hear that? Help me understand.
So I didn't mean to say that the cost is not stable. When I say it's growing, that's under, and I think Julia can come in and speak a little bit more about that because she's been working more on that bill, but that's a reflection of sort of, as if the program were passed, then over time, more children might take up the program, might participate more in the program. And then over time, the number of students eligible for federal government programs for school meals might decline. And so there's lots of assumptions around those two things. And that's why I think the cost increases, in the out years for that.
And does that project a decline in poverty in Vermont? Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. In terms of the child tax credit, is there not data that suggests tax credits like this actually help with population growth? And is there any factor trying to predict that?
Our office did not sort of dynamically score the, or make a projection that this might increase families coming to Vermont, or incentivizing people to have more children. We didn't see enough research to sort of make a definitive statement any way or the other. The child tax credit that was put in place for tax year 21 from the federal government had, numerous, second level effects on child poverty and, child hunger. But that type of thing is not something that we are sort of scoring here for the purposes of, the budget.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay.
So the other sort of, I guess, small wrinkle here, and I'll turn it over to Dan, but in the conversations yesterday, there was also a discussion about potentially adding an additional $2 million in revenues just to give the appropriations committee more space to operate and to potentially prepare for any agreements that might happen in the budget conference committee or the tax committee committees of conference. And so that can either come up through by raising additional revenues or by parent or doing tax reduction. So you could pare back the child tax credit, for instance. And so we were asked, our office, to sort of look at some various fee proposals that would raise $2 million. And so I guess at this point, I'll stop and turn it over to Dan just to talk just quickly about, potentially a couple ways to raise $2 million or so.
So.
Good afternoon.
Okay, good.
Am I showing up on your screen?
You are showing up at the top, but we're still looking at Graham's screen share. So.
Okay, that's fine. I'm fine with letting him drive this, and then I'll speak.
Okay, well, I was gonna say, Graham, can you, okay, we're still going through that one. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Dan Dickerson from the Joint Fiscal Office. Yeah, I showed up to this meeting between the finance chair and the appropriations chair, and was asked to identify a few fees that, the smallest number of fees as possible that could be increased to get to this 2 million threshold. And so I've put together a few options that would get you there. Two of the fees we talked about, they were a part of the DFR fees discussion last week, the broker dealer fees, and then the insurance appointment fees. And then there's an additional category of fees that I don't know if this committee has talked about in the past, but they are annual report fees that are paid by various business entities to the Secretary of State. And these get deposited in the Secretary of State Services Fund. This fund is swept at the end of each or any unobligated funds, or any unobligated monies in this fund are swept to the general fund at the end of a fiscal year. So all of these fees go into special funds, but they're all special funds that are swept to the general fund. So it's pretty cleanly general fund money if you raise these fees. And so the first option that and I guess I'll give a little more background on these annual report fees, since like I said, I don't know if you've talked about them before. But if you start a corporation, an LLC, a nonprofit, and a few other business entities, you have to register with the Secretary of State. I believe there is a separate, there may be a separate registration fee that's paid, but as you operate in the state, you are required to file reports either annually or, in the case of nonprofits, biannually. And for each of those reports, you pay a fee. And so the fees that I've focused on for raising revenue are those paid by corporations, either foreign or domestic. And foreign means, I believe, located outside of Vermont. And then, so it could be another state or it could be another country. And then an LLC, whether foreign or domestic, and then a nonprofit, which has the same fee regardless of whether you're foreign and domestic. And so the nonprofit reporting fee, and as I noted, these are biennial, is currently $20. That was last raised in 2013. For LLCs, if you are a Vermont, or if you are a domestic, excuse me, LLC, I believe you're currently paying, let me double check here. You are currently paying $35, and if you're a foreign LLC, you're currently paying $140. And once again, these were last increased in 2013. And then if you were a domestic corporation, you are paying a $45 fee for your annual report. And if you were a foreign corporation, you are paying $200 for your annual report. And so the option 1 and option 2 include increases to these fees at approximately a 22% inflation rate, which I looked at inflation from about February 2013 to February of this year, which is the most recent month of inflation that's been reported for 2022. And that got me, I think rounding up or down for a few just to get to, I think, an even number. For domestic corporations, an increase from 45 to 55. For foreign corporations, an increase from 200 to 245. For domestic LLCs, an increase from 35 to 45. For foreign LLCs, an increase from 140 to 170. And for nonprofits, an increase from 20 to 25. And that raises a little over $1 million annually based on current report filings. And then sticking to option 1, this would include a two DFR fee increases, one for broker dealers going from 120 to 125. This fee was last raised in 2019. This $5 increase would raise about $580,000. And then for insurance appointments, this was also last changed in 2019. This would raise the fee from 60 to 61, which would be $425,000. So in total, this option 1 gets you to $2.05 million. Option 2 includes the same annual report fee proposal at $1.05 million. And then also increases the broker dealer fee from 120 to 130. So the broker dealer would be a 1.16 million. So you'd be at about 2.2 for option 2. And then option 3 is just raising the insurance appointment fee by $5, which would by itself would raise a little over 2 million. So those are the 3 options using fees that with revenues that pretty cleanly get swept to the general fund. If you increase them, you're not increasing any operational or administrative costs. The only caveat I will say is, I think the general rule for DFR fees, as Graham noted, was that these aren't really bound by the desire to keep the level of the fee at the level of the administrative cost. The annual report fees don't fall under that exemption in 32 VSA. So while these fees, if you increase them, they would go to the general fund. I think if you were worried about adhering to this sort of operational practice of some fees being kept at the level of the administrative cost, the annual report fees could be a little more challenging to raise. But the DFR fees aren't covered under that operational rule, I guess I'll say.
Dan, was the insurance appointment fee the one where we were at the top level? One of them, or was that the mutual funds? One of them we were
We're,
Rhode Island.
that's the mutual fund fee. We're pretty, yeah, I think we're either one, 2 or 3. I thought Massachusetts might also be ahead of us, but with the appointment fees, I think with the mutual fund, broker dealer, insurance appointment, we're fairly high in all of them. I think top 10, but I think the mutual fund is where we're pretty close to number 1. The others, I think we're, somewhere a little bit lower, but I don't know that off the top of my head. I know the DFR put something together in the past that had the state rankings, but I did some looking for it last Thursday, but I wasn't able to locate it.
Senator Hardy has a question.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Dan, you said that these are swept to the general fund, but are there any costs that come out of them first? Does the Secretary of State or DFR have administrative costs that have to be paid first?
Yes, at least for the Secretary of State Services Fund, it states that any unobligated dollars would get swept to the general fund. But as I noted, raising those annual report fees wouldn't be any additional ongoing work, other than updating their website and their forms to have the new fee. So I don't think it would result in them keeping any additional money to cover their costs, especially if the General Assembly only appropriated them a certain amount.
So the assumption is that the amount of the increase would all be able to go to the general fund?
Yes.
Okay.
I wanted to explore that same point, Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Pierce.
Dan, is there discretion? I mean, we're getting a new Secretary of State. So if I were newly elected statewide official, I might shuffle some priorities, and sometimes that has costs. And then I would ask staff to look at how we would pay for that. Is the Secretary of State hamstrung by these funds at all, or might we find that there were less at the bottom to sweep if we went down this path?
I think I would have to do a little more research to figure out whether, the Secretary of State is getting all of that office's operating costs from revenues to that fund. I don't think that that's the case.
But that's not the question. The question is, are they allowed to use those funds the way they want, or are they sort of structured in a way that they're to cover X, and after that, the legislature can sweep them back?
I think they're bound by whatever their spending authority is. And so if the legislature only appropriates them X amount of money, then that's what they have to spend, regardless of whether, if they were entirely funded by the services fund, which let's say raises $3 million a year, but the legislature appropriated $2.5 million, then they have $2.5 million to spend, and that other $500,000 would be swept.
Okay, if you could be certain on that, I'd be grateful before we explore this too much.
I think we will have to have the Secretary of State's office in. We'll try and get them booked in ASAP if we're going to go down this road. I'm pretty sure they won't be happy, but we'll find out. All right. So committee, those are some of the revenue options that we come up with. They by and large will not hit average Vermonters. And the child tax credit will. So we're kind of in that spot. Senator Sirotkin.
I believe we asked for, someone said they had some comparison on the broker and insurance appointment fees compared to other states. And what did we raise those from in 2019?
That's on the sheet.
It says we raised it to 120, but I don't know what we raised it from.
Yeah, that's on. I found that last week on the agenda. Last Thursday. We had a table. And Dan, you had that table, it's under you. And that was, the securities was raised in 2016, right, to 2,000 initial and 1,500, am I reading that? And this proposal would raise it how much?
Yes, the prior to 2016, the mutual fund fees were 600 for the initial and 600 for renewals. And in 2016, that was raised to 2,000 for initial, 1,500 renewal. I believe the proposal that would raise 6 million is just to increase the renewal from 1,500 to 1,750. And then I have the 2019 fee bill in front of me for insurance, the producer appointment. That fee was previously $60 and it was increased to, and this was previously a fee that was paid every 2 years. So it was increased to 120 every 2 years. And then starting this fiscal year, it was reduced to 60, but it's now an annual fee. So it's still effectively the 120.
We did that last year, just, I remember that in the insurance housekeeping bill. So it's actually,
the broker dealer
it's
fee.
120 every 2 years, and we split it into 60, because we used to get a swing in the revenues, and so when you were doing, so this, but we didn't increase it in 19, we just divided it out.
Well, you did both. In 19, you increased it from 60 to 120 every 2 years. And so that was the case for FY20 and FY21. And then starting in, and then also in 2019, you said starting in FY22, this will now be an annual fee, which will be 1/2 of what the previous 2-year fee. So it went down from 120 to 60. So you did both of those things in 2019, but one of them only became effective in 2020, in FY 2022, which was making it an annual
Okay,
fee.
but we're still dealing with 60 and 120. What did it come up from? Was it in 2018?
Previously, it was 60 every 2 years. Now it's 60.
60, okay,
every
so
year.
we went from 60 every 2 years to
120.
to 120 every 2 years. So it went to 60 a year.
Yes.
And you're
And then
proposing,
broker dealers that fee was previously 90, and now it is currently 120. And that was raised in 2019.
So do we have a chart of how we compare to other states?
I believe the DFR had that info. I can reach out to them to see. I thought that Commissioner Pishak had said that he could get that pretty quickly. So I can reach out to them and try to get it to you ASAP.
yeah, they said they
I
had,
don't
that
have
they did that. Okay, producers, lines, brokers.
And which ones are the ones that have reciprocity or retribution, whatever?
Yeah, not the, anyone that hasn't been increased in a long time, I figured out going through this.
Yeah, it's the fee for producers. So it's different from producer appointments. If you're a
Yes,
producer,
insurance
then,
producers, it was
Yeah.
that is a retaliatory one, right? Because I
Right.
asked about that, that was last raised in 99.
right. So if we increase our fees in Vermont, then and increase those revenues, then we decrease revenues that come from other states that charge higher fees. So it would be net zero.
So we don't touch those. But the appointment fees are not retaliatory, right?
Correct.
Okay. I was looking at all kinds of mortgage brokers, but. All right. So committee. I think we've kind of finished the revenue section. I was thinking we might take a break. If, Graham, have you got a hard stop here? Abby is out sick. But I thought we might be able to have some discussion, and Graham's got proposals for the child tax credit.
I don't have a hard stop. All I have is that additional child tax credit, those
Yeah.
proposals.
So I thought we might take about a 15-minute break, just let all of the numbers sink in, and then come back and talk more about the tax credit and policy. We've been talking about how to make the numbers work, but I think we ought to come back and just kind of look at the numbers in the bill where we are shorthanded because it seems that the virus is going through our staff. But we can walk through it and talk about it, okay? So Faith, I think we'll go on a 15-minute break.
Ending live stream.